The cop strutted into the room with an air that was impossible to ignore, his chest puffed out, every step radiating a misplaced sense of superiority. His badge gleamed under the lights, and the way he adjusted his belt before speaking made it clear he believed himself to be the most powerful man in the room. He spoke loudly, as if his authority depended on volume alone, and the smirk on his face hinted at a lifetime of unchecked behavior. This was not confidence, it was arrogance, the kind that grows when power goes unchallenged for too long. He eyed those around him, scanning faces, searching for any sign of resistance, and the moment he sensed hesitation, he seized it like a predator spotting weakness. His words were sharp, laced with condescension, each sentence designed to belittle rather than to enforce order. He mocked small gestures, exaggerated minor mistakes, and took pleasure in making others feel insignificant. The room wasn't his courtroom, nor was it his parade ground, yet he carried himself as though the walls bent to his authority. This wasn't about law or justice, it was about ego. Every move he made seemed rehearsed, a performance he had perfected over the years. The swagger, the tilt of his chin, the rolling of his shoulders, he had worn this mask so often it had become his skin. His uniform, instead of symbolizing service, had become a costume that shielded his insecurities. Behind his arrogance was a man desperate to be respected, but instead of earning it, he demanded it through intimidation. He thrived on the silence of others, mistaking it for admiration when it was nothing more than restraint. He chuckled at his own remarks, turning simple questions into insults. When someone tried to answer, he cut them off mid-sentence, twisting their words to mock them further. His laughter was hollow but loud, filling the room with a forced dominance. He tapped his fingers on the table, leaned back in his chair, and smirked as though daring anyone to challenge him. The arrogance wasn't subtle, it dripped from every gesture, every look, every word. To him, this was not just authority, it was entertainment. The longer he spoke, the bolder he became. His tone sharpened, his eyes narrowed, and he leaned into his own sense of superiority. He took offense where there was none, turning neutral expressions into targets of ridicule. A quiet glance became a sign of disrespect, and a simple hesitation became evidence of weakness. He needed fuel for his arrogance, and he found it in the most harmless of places. He wasn't protecting law and order, he was protecting his ego, feeding it with every laugh and every insult. Around him, people exchanged looks, some of discomfort, others of frustration, but none dared to step forward. The cop thrived on that silence, twisting it into proof of his own power. He believed no one had the courage to stand against him, that his badge was an untouchable shield. His arrogance was not just directed at the people in front of him but at the very idea that anyone, anywhere, could ever question his authority. It was the type of arrogance that blinds a man, making him believe he is invincible. His posture grew more rigid as he continued, his voice booming louder, trying to fill not only the room but also the gap inside him that respect was supposed to occupy. He exaggerated his stories, painting himself as the hero in every confrontation, the conqueror in every struggle. But behind the swagger, there was desperation, the need to be recognized, the craving to be feared. His arrogance wasn't just about pushing others down, it was about lifting himself up, no matter how hollow the pedestal. The general sat quietly, unshaken by the performance, but the cop didn't notice. His arrogance blinded him to the calm, steady presence just a few feet away. He mistook silence for weakness, composure for surrender. He laughed louder, mocked harder, and pushed further, believing he had complete control of the moment. The room grew heavier, not because of the cop's authority, but because of his arrogance that suffocated every corner. He had convinced himself that no one could challenge him, that no voice could silence his, that no presence could outshine his performance. The general sat there with an air that contrasted every ounce of the cop's bravado. His back was straight, his expression unreadable, and his silence commanded more respect than the officer's shouting ever could. He did not rush to interrupt, nor did he rise to defend himself against the mockery being flung across the room. Instead, he watched, observed, and waited, as if he had seen this scene play out countless times before. Where the cop thrived on noise, the general thrived on calm. His presence was not loud, but it was powerful, a weight in the air that grew heavier the longer he remained still. Every movement he made was deliberate, and each stillness was just as calculated. He kept his hands folded neatly, his eyes steady, his breathing even. The general's calmness wasn't born of submission, it was born of discipline, of years spent learning that power is most effective when controlled. While the officer mistook laughter for dominance, the general knew that true authority never needed to be shouted. It resided in patience, in the ability to wait for the right moment rather than force it. His composure was not an act, it was instinct, the kind that comes from decades of command. As the officer's voice grew louder, the general's silence seemed louder still. The room began to notice the contrast. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others glanced toward the general as if expecting him to react, but he gave them nothing. His stillness was unnerving because it revealed something the officer could not see: control. He wasn't rising to the bait, wasn't feeding into the mockery, and wasn't allowing his emotions to dictate his response. This calmness was more powerful than any outburst could ever be. The general had faced pressure far greater than this before. He had endured moments where decisions had life and death consequences, where chaos surrounded him, and where hesitation could not be afforded. Compared to those trials, this arrogant officer's laughter was nothing but noise. His calm was a shield, one that arrogance could not penetrate. Years of experience had taught him that power is best wielded quietly, that authority speaks through presence, not performance. The officer, however, was blind to it. He saw silence as weakness, interpreting the general's composure as surrender. He believed his words were landing blows, his mockery cutting deep, when in truth they were bouncing off a wall of steel. The general's lack of reaction only emboldened him further, driving him to push harder, to test how far he could go before cracking the man in front of him. But every insult was met with the same steady gaze, the same unshaken demeanor. The general's calm was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and deeply unsettling to those who understood its meaning. For the others in the room, the difference was becoming clearer by the second. The officer's arrogance was loud but fragile, while the general's silence was quiet but unbreakable. Where one sought attention, the other commanded it without effort. His eyes, sharp yet calm, never wavered, and when they met the gaze of others in the room, they carried the weight of a man who had led, who had endured, and who had conquered challenges far greater than the arrogance of one cop. He didn't need to defend his dignity with words, the way he sat, the way he breathed, the way he simply existed, did that for him. His calmness also carried something else: patience. He was waiting, not out of fear, but out of certainty. He knew the moment would come when the arrogance would collapse under its own weight, when silence would speak louder than shouting, and when one calculated action would undo all the cop's bluster. His restraint wasn't weakness, it was strength held in reserve, waiting for the precise moment to be released. Every soldier he had commanded would have recognized it instantly. Still, the officer continued, convinced that he had the upper hand. He leaned into his arrogance, laughed louder, spoke harsher, and circled the general with words meant to provoke. Yet the more he tried, the less effect he had. The general's calmness formed a wall he could not scale, and though he didn't see it yet, the others in the room began to. They felt the shift, the quiet dominance that overshadowed the officer's noise. The general's calm was not just an absence of reaction, it was a presence, heavy and deliberate, a reminder that true strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. The moment came when the laughter, once so loud and brash, began to feel out of place. The officer had pushed and pushed, mocking, jeering, throwing his words like stones, but something shifted in the air. It wasn't because he stopped, it was because the weight of silence from the general was becoming unbearable. The stillness that had once seemed like weakness began to feel like defiance, and the officer's confidence faltered for just a breath. His smirk returned quickly, forced and sharp, but the crack in his arrogance had already begun to show. He leaned in, raising his voice even higher, determined to regain control. He taunted with more venom, twisting his words to draw out some kind of reaction. But each attempt fell flat, echoing in a room that no longer laughed with him. The spectators' eyes no longer followed his every move, instead, they were drawn toward the calm, steady presence that refused to bow. The standoff wasn't declared out loud, but it was felt by everyone watching. It was no longer a show of arrogance, it had become a test of will. The officer didn't understand the gravity of what he had created. In his world, respect had always come through fear and intimidation. He had never faced someone who could absorb his insults without flinching, who could hold their ground without raising their voice. The general's quiet strength clashed with the officer's loud arrogance, and the tension between the two was thick enough to choke the air. The room had gone from noisy to suffocatingly silent, as though every breath was waiting for the collision they all knew was coming. The officer tried harder, walking circles, pointing fingers, laughing at his own words. Yet every laugh felt hollower than the last. The more he tried to assert dominance, the clearer it became that his power was crumbling. The general didn't move, didn't rise, didn't even blink out of rhythm. He sat like a mountain, unshaken, and that was what unsettled everyone most. A mountain does not fight with the wind, it simply endures until the storm exhausts itself. The standoff grew more dangerous with each passing moment. The officer's voice, once booming with arrogance, now carried a hint of desperation, though he masked it with forced laughter. His mockery turned sharp, even reckless, as he searched for a weak point. He threw out comments meant to draw blood, but the general's composure turned them into whispers that never landed. That was the power of the calm, every insult withered the moment it hit the air, unable to pierce through the steel presence it was aimed at. Spectators felt it too. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others shifted in their seats, realizing they were no longer simply watching a scene, they were caught in the middle of a clash of two very different kinds of power. On one side was noise, bluster, arrogance. On the other was silence, restraint, and unshakable control. The contrast was stark, and the balance of the room had already begun to tip. The officer, blinded by his own arrogance, refused to see it. He mistook his continued shouting as victory, even though his voice had lost its bite. His laughter rang out again, but this time it was met with nothing, no chuckles, no smiles, no energy to feed it. He was laughing alone, and in that loneliness, the first flicker of fear crept in. Still, he pressed forward, as though doubling down could erase the truth of what was unfolding. The general remained still, his calm no longer just a shield but a weapon. The standoff was no longer about words, it was about endurance, about who would break first. The officer's arrogance was cracking under its own weight, while the general's silence was growing sharper, more cutting, without ever needing to speak. The power had shifted, though the officer had yet to realize it. To him, the laughter was still proof of control, even as it rang emptier with each attempt. The air was thick, tense, alive with unspoken conflict. The room, once dominated by the officer's voice, now belonged to the silence that followed each word. The standoff was no longer hidden, it was the very center of the room, and everyone could feel it tightening, pulling, dragging them into a collision that was only moments away. The officer's laughter echoed for the last time before the silence swallowed it whole. His arrogance had stretched as far as it could go, circling the room like a performance meant to prove his untouchable power. Yet in that silence, the general finally moved, not dramatically, not with any outward show of anger, but with the calm precision of a man who knew the exact weight of every action he took. He reached slowly into his pocket, and the faint sound of a phone being placed on the table carried more authority than the officer's booming voice had all evening. It was such a simple act, yet it changed everything. The spectators leaned forward without realizing it, their eyes drawn to the device as if it were a weapon far greater than any badge or uniform. The officer scoffed, attempting to mask his sudden unease with another laugh. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, but there was a tremor beneath his voice, a flicker of uncertainty he could not hide. The general didn't answer. He didn't need to. His fingers moved with deliberate care as he scrolled through his contacts, his gaze steady, unbothered by the officer's attempts to hold on to the crumbling facade of control. There was no rush, no panic, no visible frustration, only certainty. The tension grew unbearable, each second of silence sharper than the last. The officer's mocking grin faltered as he realized this was no bluff, no idle gesture. The general wasn't looking for attention, he was preparing to end the charade with a single action. The phone rang. Its tone was calm, steady, professional, but in the silence of that room it thundered louder than the officer's voice ever had. Each ring echoed like a countdown, a slow march toward a reckoning. No one dared move, no one dared breathe too loudly. The officer's arrogance, once so commanding, now looked fragile, exposed under the weight of a single phone call. His smirk wavered, his eyes darted around the room, searching for reassurance that never came. When the call connected, the general's voice was calm, almost casual, yet it carried a weight that left no doubt. He spoke few words, measured and precise, each one sending a ripple through the silence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't boast, didn't explain. He simply spoke as a man who knew he would be heard, not because he demanded it, but because the world had long since learned that when he spoke, people listened. The officer's arrogance shrank with every syllable, his earlier bravado folding in on itself. The spectators' eyes widened as they began to understand who was on the other end of that call. The authority in the general's tone wasn't the kind that could be faked, it was rooted in connections, in power that reached far beyond the walls of the room. Each word he spoke was deliberate, a signal that the balance of control had shifted entirely. The officer was no longer the one dictating the scene, he had been reduced to a bystander in a story he thought he controlled. The officer tried to interject, to laugh it off as though nothing had changed, but his voice betrayed him. It cracked, stumbled, lost the sharp edge it once carried. His words, once dripping with arrogance, now sounded desperate, flimsy in the shadow of the call. The general, however, didn't spare him so much as a glance. His calm remained unbroken, his voice steady, as though the officer's presence was irrelevant, as though he had already been dismissed. Every second of that call stretched into eternity. Each pause, each nod, each simple acknowledgement carried weight. It was clear to everyone watching that something far greater was unfolding, that strings were being pulled beyond their view, that the power dynamics had shifted completely. The officer's authority, which moments ago seemed unshakable, now appeared paper-thin. His badge, his laughter, his arrogance, all of it crumbled under the quiet force of a man who needed only a phone to command silence. The call wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. The general spoke with the ease of someone who had made thousands like it before, someone accustomed to his words setting events into motion. He did not explain what would follow, and he did not need to. The mere act of placing that call had already redrawn the lines of control. The officer stood frozen, trying to mask his unraveling composure, but everyone could see it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers fidgeted, the way his laughter had disappeared into the void of silence. The phone clicked as the call ended, and the sound seemed final, like a gavel striking wood, like a sentence being handed down. The general set it back on the table gently, his movements unhurried, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to announce what had just been set into motion. The truth hung heavy in the air, the officer had laughed too long, pushed too far, and in a single call, the balance of power had been stripped from his hands. Respect was no longer a choice in that room, it was a presence that settled into every corner, unavoidable and undeniable. The general did not demand it with words, nor did he raise his voice to force it from those around him. Respect came in the way he sat, in the way he carried himself, and in the silence that spoke louder than any order ever could. The very air seemed to acknowledge it. The same people who had once shifted uncomfortably under the officer's arrogance now sat straighter, their focus drawn to the man who had said so little yet commanded so much. The officer, who had spent the entire time thriving on mockery and dominance, now found himself drowning in the absence of both. His badge no longer felt like a shield. His laughter no longer felt like a weapon. He had relied on intimidation to command respect, but intimidation collapses the moment it meets someone who cannot be shaken. The general was that man, and the officer now stood face to face with a truth he had never considered: respect cannot be demanded through fear, it must be earned. The general's calmness had shifted into something sharper, something that no one in the room could ignore. Without saying a word, he forced the officer to confront the emptiness of his arrogance. The silence had already dismantled the performance, but now the weight of presence demanded acknowledgement. Every glance toward the general carried an unspoken agreement. This was the man who held real authority, the kind of authority that came not from position, but from character. The officer tried to hold on to scraps of dignity, but his efforts faltered. He straightened his shoulders, forced his chin higher, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered toward the general and then away, unable to hold steady. He had mocked, laughed, and jeered only moments ago, but now his words failed him. His arrogance had been stripped bare, and in its place was a man who suddenly understood what it meant to be powerless. Respect was enforced not through confrontation, but through inevitability. The general's every movement carried the weight of years of discipline, of battles fought both on the field and within himself. He did not need to intimidate, the mere memory of the phone call was enough. Everyone in that room knew something had been set in motion, and even though the general had not explained what, they knew it was enough to dismantle the officer's false sense of control. The quiet certainty of his actions left no room for challenge. For the others in the room, the lesson was clear. True authority does not mock. True authority does not laugh at the expense of others. True authority does not rise and fall on noise. It sits steady, unwavering, confident in silence, commanding respect without having to claw for it. The general embodied that truth so fully that even the officer, who had resisted every sign of weakness before, now found himself bowing to it in small, unintentional ways. The drop of his shoulders, the hesitation in his voice, the way his eyes lowered, it was respect, not given freely, but forced by reality. The room was no longer his stage. It belonged to the general. The officer had fought with arrogance and lost, not because he was shouted down, but because he had been silenced by a man who didn't need to prove himself. Respect had been demanded without a single command. It had been enforced by presence alone. No one questioned it. No one resisted it. It simply was. Every spectator felt the change settle into them as well. Their loyalty, their trust, their quiet admiration shifted entirely. The general's authority did not ask for acknowledgement, it compelled it. In the face of arrogance, it revealed itself as the stronger force, one that could not be broken, one that could not be mocked away. It was respect forged through years of discipline, through the calmness of knowing when to act, and through the unshakable truth that real power does not need to explain itself. And so the room, once loud with laughter and mockery, sat in stillness under the weight of respect that had been both demanded and enforced without a single raised voice.